It is the clash of two superpowers. The most populous country in the world meets the second most populous country in the world. Together they account for over a third of the world's population, their economies are gigantic, their militaries are among the strongest in the world, and both states are nuclear powers. We are talking about China and India, who are currently clashing against a spectacular backdrop. The two countries are connected by a border over 3,500 kilometers long in the world's highest mountain range, the Himalayas, and this is precisely where the conflict originated. For decades, the two states have been unable to agree on a uniform borderline. And where there used to be attempts at negotiations, both states are now acting with threats and the use of their military. Time and again, troops from both sides clash and bloody battles break out. But why is it so difficult to reach an agreement? Why is it escalating right now, and why could this conflict have far-reaching global consequences? We take a look at all these questions in today's video. The origins of the conflict go back to colonial times. India was a British colony for a long time, and, from the end of the year 1880, there was increasing competition for supremacy in Central Asia between the British Empire and Russia. In order to consolidate their own position and prevent Russian expansion, the British increasingly reached for the Himalayas and Tibet. However, as Tibet, which was largely independent at the time, refused to negotiate with the British, the government in London quickly sent a military expedition and declared the region a British protectorate. This particularly angered the Chinese, who also laid claim to the region. This led to negotiations between Great Britain, China and Tibet in the year 1914. The British agreed to renounce their claims to Tibet and established the so-called McMahon Line as the border between China and India. Tibet was to retain its independence and exist as a buffer state between the British colonial empire, China and Russia. In reality, however, this treaty was never ratified by the Chinese and the demarcation was therefore not recognized. And this is where the later conflict was to break out. Let's jump to the year 1950. India had shortly before gained its independence from Great Britain, and Mao Zedong emerged victorious in the Chinese Civil War. He founded the People's Republic of China, and the Communist Party became increasingly imperialistic. It invaded the previously independent Tibet and annexed it completely without further ado. And so it eventually became embroiled in the border conflict with India. The Chinese declared that they had never ratified the McMahon Line as a border and that they would only be prepared to accept it if India ceded the Aksai Chin region, an important province in the Kashmir region, to China. India refused, as they themselves laid claim to it, and the Indians continued to insist on the McMahon Line as the border. And so the atmosphere between the two countries continued to heat up, and both prepared for an open border war. The Indian army was far inferior to the Chinese, and the northern attackers were able to advance far across the border. Around 2,000 soldiers died, and this defeat was deeply engraved in the Indian identity. In addition, China allied itself with India's archenemy Pakistan and gave it the entire region of Kashmir, to which India actually laid claim. This conflict also continues to this day. This led to ceasefire negotiations, although these were conducted by proxy countries as both sides refused to talk to each other. The so-called line of actual control, i.e. the de facto border between the two states, was established. To this day, however, the two countries interpret the border quite differently. It was also difficult to define the exact course of the border, as the plateau there is barely populated and there were few land records. And so the maps of the Chinese and Indian border patrols still show completely different border lines today. As a result, further conflicts were naturally inevitable. Both countries sometimes interpret the border one way and sometimes the other, but there was at least a diplomatic breakthrough with the soldiers of both countries patrolling unarmed. Especially in recent years, since India and China in particular have become increasingly self-confident on the world stage, there have been repeated violent clashes. As recently as the year 2020, there was a military incident at the line of actual control in which at least 20 Indian soldiers and 4 Chinese soldiers died. A mass brawl is said to have broken out between the two sides. And in recent months there have been repeated provocations on both sides, often broken up with clubs and stones. Quite absurd, really, when you consider that two nuclear powers are facing each other there. However, this should in no way obscure the fact that the conflict has enormous potential for escalation at any time. China is investing heavily in the region's infrastructure, which should enable the rapid transportation of troops. And we can see how resolutely China is asserting its claims in the South China Sea. The Indian Army is also sending more and more soldiers and material to the region, and the Indian Air Force now has a strong presence there. The Indian Defense Minister has stated that they are prepared for anything. An extended war between the two superpowers would be a catastrophe for the whole of Asia and probably the entire world. The alliance systems of both states could quickly escalate into a global conflict and lead to a global economic disaster. Fortunately, it does not currently look as if either side is seeking to escalate, but diplomatically both are still at an impasse. Negotiations last year again ended inconclusively, and a quick solution to the conflict therefore seems unlikely.